Our community story begins in 1530 in Flanders under the rule of Spanish Netherlands, where church and state were one. Mennonites faced severe persecution, leading many to flee to Amsterdam or Haarlem in the Netherlands, or to Danzig, Prussia, now Poland. By 1650, those who remained often perished by drowning or burning. Mennonites were considered outlaws for several reasons. They practiced adult baptism, forming a free church. Secondly, they taught everyone to read and study the Bible, a practice limited to priests. Thirdly, they advocated for peacemaking and non-violence. Lastly, they believed in personal prayer to Jesus Christ. They experienced religious freedom in Poland for a full century, and then accepted the Russian Queen's offer to move to Ukraine, known as South Russia. In the 1870s, the Russian government attempted to Russify them through education and threats of military service. This led David Clausen and 91 other farmers to eventually choose Manitoba, Canada as their new home. Invited by both U.S. and Canadian officials, Clausen toured potential farm areas in 1873. Clausen and several delegates secured the promises Mennonites sought from the Dominion of Canada, including exemption from military service, freedom to practice their faith, and the right to have their own schools, preserving faith and language. Clausen, pictured with his wife and youngest daughter, preferred the protection of a monarchy. Many decided to leave Russia to immigrate to Canada. Upon arriving in Manitoba at the Forks, also known as Upper Fort Garry, several men set out to explore. Heinrich Ratzlaff, the first Rosenort mayor, described their journey to the Scratching River. We arrived at the river, unhitched our horses, and were swarmed by mosquitoes. We camped overnight in the wilderness, and in the morning decided the land was more appropriate for grain farming. Ratzlaff wrote in German on a tree trunk, "It is good to be here. Let us build our homes," with the drawing of a cow. The Scratching River area was chosen for its proximity to Winnipeg's markets and rich soil. Clausen's caravan arrived and the women wept seeing wilderness, heat, and mosquitoes. Clausen interrupted, instructing the men to find firewood and the ladies to prepare food. Their very first meal they gave thanks for was waffles on the banks of the Morris River. Families numbering 80 souls settled this place of roses in twin villages. Within 2 weeks, the first outdoor church service was held as they sang under the open sky at the funeral service for Ratzlaff's mother. The first winter was the coldest and harshest recorded in Manitoba's history. Ratzlaff and brother-in-law Isaac Lowen built a 500-square-foot cabin and lean-to for the animals. The potatoes froze in the basement. Others lived in riverbank dugouts and semlins, and the first Mennonite baby born in Rosenort was Johann F. Duick. He was born in January. David Clausen moved his extended family, most of Rosenhoff, to Winnipeg for the winter, learning English and earning money delivering milk from their newly purchased cows, returning to Rosenhoff in the spring. In May 1875, seeding began. Mayor Ratzlaff and Minister Abraham Clausen moved away to Nebraska, and a plague of locusts wiped out many crops across Manitoba and the Dakotas, a very tough beginning. Wildfires were a threat. Many homes and personal diaries and antiques were burned, and the villages formed an insurance company, which was the beginning of Red River Mutual. To begin, food was scarce, with common meals of bread, noodles, and soup. Clothing was frugal, with patched denim pants and homemade moccasins or wooden shoes. Land around Rosenort was surveyed to have land strips running east and west, 660 feet by 2 miles. In Rosenhoff, they had strips 330 feet by 4 miles long. This was a village system Mennonites had used for centuries. Yard sites were chosen by drawing lots. All homes were first built between the river to the west and the village trail to the east. The old village trail, used for hundreds of years by migratory indigenous people, was in place when the Mennonites came. This old trail ran from Roseau, Minnesota, right through the villages to Delta Beach, north of Portage la Prairie. Presumably, remnants of an old trading post were visible, since it was well known that the old John W. Dick Rosenhoff store was on the same location. Spiritual life focused on a disciplined lifestyle. 2 congregations formed due to winter travel difficulties. Reverend Peter M. Krager led the Rosenort congregation, and Deacon John Lowen led the Rosenhoff congregation. Church services rotated in private homes, with hosts providing dinner afterwards. Music was vital, with hymn books and poetry writing encouraged. As goes our schools, so goes our church, was the motto of the pioneers. The first classes began in permanent homes, serving as school and church buildings. Rosenhoff and Rosenort both became public district schools with government grants, maintaining religious instruction, the German language, and private control. The community was unaware that education was under provincial jurisdiction, not federal. Promises made federally were not upheld provincially. Schools were essential, education was valued, and the ministerial was in charge of the curriculum. Initially, textbooks included the Feeble, a primer of Bible stories, the Old and New Testament, Catechism, and a church hymn book. Geography, history, and language studies were added later. Math was taught on blackboards, and students used slates rather than paper until about 1925. School terms lasted 6 months due to farming demands. Classes were taught in High German for the first 3 years, and then in English from grade 4 on. A major crisis occurred in 1881 when John Haldeman, an American evangelist, held meetings in homes and mandated a rebaptism for young and old people who joined the new church in 1882, called Church of God in Christ. It caused deep family rifts. The Kleingemeinde Mennonites believed in a universal church, and Haldeman taught that his was the only true church. The Haldeman and Kleingemeinde members alternated using the schools in Rosenort and Rosenhoff for church services, with blackboards dividing the sanctuary and the school areas. In 1907, a government decree required district schools to fly the Union Jack, leading to the privatization of Mennonite schools. During World War II, laws mandated English-only instruction, causing friction. The Haldemans switched to English education in 1914, but the Kleingemeinde resisted until about 1924. By 1926, all schools transitioned to English. A quote from Mrs. Isaac Brandt: "The school system changed from private to public. Initially, we had more English than German, marked by a card indicating which language to speak. After a few years, it was all English." In 1919, the Haldeman people built their own church, followed by the Kleingemeinde. In 1920, the Rosenhoff and Rosenort congregations merged into a new church building, with ministers, deacons, and song leaders leading the service. Men and women sat separately, with silent prayers done by kneeling on the benches. Singing was a cappella. The ministerials sat up front. Married women wore prayer coverings. Essential village services included stores as community hubs, blacksmiths, lumber yards, and postal deliveries. The first big business was Rosenort's Dutch-style windmill, which served for 40 years, a true landmark. Though built in Steinbach, it operated best with the wind on the banks of the Scratching River. They floated, boated and dragged it over the ice on the Red River in 1879. Jacob Taves, Isaac Lowen, and Franz Fraze were the owners. Later, Peter Taves and Gerhard Rempel followed as millers. Rosenhoff villagers had a granary-style mill for grinding grain. A cheese factory was built central to both locations. Dams were built so that there would be drinking water for cattle. The farmers took turns scraping and harrowing the roads. Helena Clausen-Ides, a midwife, worked with Dr. Robert McTavish for about 35 years. She delivered babies and treated illnesses, never losing an infant or a mother to infection. Her last delivery was Abe D. Friesen in 1938, 2 months before she passed away. Other midwives, bone setters, and nurses were Mrs. Maria Ides Friesen, Mrs. Margaret Friesen Brandt, Mrs. Elizabeth Workington Brandt, Mrs. Frederica Roche, who trained in Germany, and her daughter-in-law, Justina Brandt Roche, as well as Mrs. Maria Friesen Workington. Their gifts of healing were wholeheartedly endorsed by the church. In the spring of 1894, diphtheria and scarlet fever epidemics claimed many children's lives, causing great sorrow in both villages. 15 children died of this illness. Cold symptoms led to difficulty breathing, leading to stupor, coma, or death. There was a 50% death rate due to suffocation. This sickness lasted for about 2 months. The Rosenhoff Cemetery, 1907 to 1951, saw 136 burials, with half under the age of 18 during the Spanish flu epidemic. 4 caskets had to be placed into one grave due to harsh winter conditions and illness. Despite health concerns, the community was also full of life. Weddings took place on Sundays during or right after the Sunday worship service. Buns were baked, hams smoked, cucumbers pickled, and tables set. It was a community of faith event, and many gifts were given. Children were hoped and prayed for and welcomed as a blessing. Agriculture was the main livelihood of our villages. Potatoes, oats, wheat, and barley were seeded early. Wheat was ground into flour. Beef, chicken, and hogs, as well as horses, were raised. New farming technology was embraced rapidly in the Rosenort area. Our Mennonites loved the land, and our villages had beautiful names. The early newspapers found Mennonites unique as pioneers because we came as multi-generational extended families. Brothers helped brothers, sisters, mothers, and aunties worked together. It was noted that women worked as partners to their husbands in daily farm chores, not just hosting tea parties as ladies of the manor. Children were given duties as well. Young couples began married life in cottages on their parents' yards. Later that year, they would build their own homes. As families grew, large 2-story square farmhouses were built. Yard sites often had several homes, including one for widowed or retired grandparents. Homes often became mobile as villagers moved to acreages or were sold to be moved to other sites in the community. No buildings were wasted. Transportation moved slowly. It was a 3-day journey to the Winnipeg markets to sell produce or livestock with ox and wagon. A strong team of horses could do it in 5 hours. Newspapers noted Mennonites set aside 5 days with 500 men and their 380 wagons to build an 8-mile corduroy road through the St. Norbert Swamp. The only wages were the access to the markets. Family and faith connections to Steinbach area meant the Albany Ferry was used to cross the Red River. Businesses grew in response to agricultural needs. The area has always had inventors and entrepreneurs. Many businesses grew and flourished for their season. In World War I, 2 community boys, Otto Roche and Jake Cornelson, volunteered to fight. Jacob was killed by injuries at Vimy Ridge. We will remember their service. Rosenort villagers exercised their religious war exemption in 1914. They donated thousands to meet the victory loan pledge of $1 million the Manitoba Mennonites made to win the war. The Great Depression hit hard with farm incomes plummeting and drought lasting a decade. The King and Queen made a royal visit in 1939. Shortly afterward, war was declared. In 1941, the government instituted alternative service to the draft, and over 3,000 Mennonite men in Manitoba served in forestry, firefighting, and farming away from their homes. 82 were ours. The war accelerated the decline of the German language in our area. 9 young men chose to go overseas. Louis Coisseau and Benjamin Enns, both Haldeman background, gave their lives for their country. Johnny Weens, Henry Esau, Elmer, Harry, and John Rempel, David and Arthur Entz made it safely home. In 1948, 32 conservative families, half of Rosenhoff, now Riverside, moved to Mexico, leading to cultural shifts. The community saw changes in dress, wedding customs, and an increased focus on evangelism and foreign missions. The community has always known how to find family-friendly entertainment, from organized games, porch swings, music, biking, field picnics at harvest, or playing with pets. Rosenort and Riverside have always had many vibrant businesses. Enjoy looking back to the 1970s. David Clausen was warned by an indigenous man that the area was called Land of Rushing Waters. Villages suffered repeated damages in 1948, 50, and 66. The village of Rosenort was diked after the 1966 flood. The flood of 79 led to personal flood protection. Then, back-to-back floods of 96 and 97 were horrendous as Riverside lost dozens of homes. Most homes along River Road South and in Riverside were flooded. The most significant change to Rosenort was the dike and diversion around Rosenort. This provided flood protection, enabling rapid community growth. Part of Riverside has a dike and is being connected to Rosenort with a high-access road. The Old Village Trail exists only in Riverside. It ran where the hydro line is on Section 20, but is mostly covered with dikes or paved over. Our families live in 345 homes and 77 apartments. There are another 50 homes in Riverside and many others in the surrounding municipal area. 140 businesses thrive locally. The industrial park, fire hall, public workshop, as well as the daycare are fairly new additions. Rosenort has 6 churches, three dining establishments, pop-up coffee shops, several parks, 2 schools, an airstrip, and a lovely river trail. May the original vision and values of faith, family, education, and enterprise of the 31 families who made their homes on the peaceful Scratching River be rewarded.